The Battle of Plassey had made English the kingmakers in Bengal. But we know that they did not just stop at that, they eventually did become a sort of king themselves. They assumed the sovereign power in Bengal. How was this transition brought about? Hi, I am Bharat and I welcome you all to the 5th episode of the Love of History series. In this episode, we are going to decode how the English transitioned from the kingmakers to the company state in Bengal and what role did the Battle of Buxar play in this. At the outset, let me make it very clear, even though Plassey is more famous as a battle, but it was Battle of Buxar that was more significant in its political consequences. Before moving ahead, let's recall why Bengal was the starting point of the British conquest of India. Bengal was one of the richest provinces of India, extremely prosperous. Commercially, it was a center of trade and it yielded a huge revenue to the treasury. Naturally, the East India Company had enormous economic interests in Bengal. Now, one major source of the company power in Bengal was the Farman of 1717 issued by Farrukhsiyar. In fact, the company had a tradition of getting its privileges acknowledged from the Mughal sovereigns of India. If you remember, the very process of setting up of factories in different parts of India started after Mughal Emperor Jahangir had granted a Farman to that effect to the East India Company. This tradition continued even under the Mughal emperors Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. Now, coming to the Bengal story, the most important Farman to this effect was issued in 1717 by Mughal Emperor Farrukhsiyar. Now, this Farman granted company enormous concessions and privileges. For example, it allowed the company to mint coins. Also, it allowed the company the right to duty-free trade in Bengal, and in order to enable this duty-free trade, it allowed the company to issue dastaks. What were these dastaks? These were the passes that were issued to enable the duty-free trade in Bengal. Now, because of the concessions granted by this Farman to the East India Company, this Farman is known as the Magna Carta of the East India Company in India. But this Farman was a constant source of conflict between the Nawabs of Bengal and the East India Company in Bengal. After the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, Bengal was ruled by strong Nawabs like Murshid Quli Khan, Ali Vardi Khan. These Nawabs were practically independent and they were strong and they did not allow any misuse of privileges. For example, they tried to check the company ambitions by preventing the misuse of dastaks. They did not allow the company officials to misuse the privileges granted by the 1717 Farman to carry on their private trade. Also, they did not allow the East India Company to mint the coins. Even though this right was granted by the Farman of 1717, but the Bengal Nawabs did not allow company to mint coins. Also, they did not allow any fortifications without authorization. For example, when first and second Carnatic wars were going on in the south, in Bengal, Nawab Ali Vardi Khan did not allow the French and the English East India companies to engage in any armed hostilities. So, as long as Bengal was ruled by these strong Nawabs, the East India Company could not dominate. Shuja-ud-Daula was only 23 when he became the Nawab of Bengal in 1756. He had his own share of rivals, threats and internal political problems. Moreover, at this point of time, the Third Carnatic War was taking place. The company thought that this young Nawab would not be able to protect their interests. Governor Drake decided that the time for showdown has come. So, the company started defying the authority of Nawab by misuse of dastaks, second by building unauthorized fortifications, and third by giving refuge to the rivals of Nawab in Calcutta. For example, Krishna Ballabh was given refuge at Calcutta and he was a rival of Nawab. Nawab, of course, was offended by this activity of the East India Company and he gave warning to the company. When his warnings were ignored, he decided to show his strength by taking over the English factory at Qasim Bazaar. Again, he offered negotiations, but his offer was rejected. Then Nawab continued with his offensive and he took over the English factory at Calcutta. Now, Siraj at this point of time thought that the company has been crushed and he went back to celebrate his easy victory. This was the biggest mistake done by Siraj. The company was not defeated, it was simply put on the back foot. Siraj's attack on Calcutta came at a time when the English were engaged with French in the Third Carnatic War in the south. Robert Clive arrived from Madras with a strong force. He attacked Nawab's forces at Hooghly and defeated the French at Chandarnagar. Now, Siraj preferred a negotiated settlement, but a confident Clive decided on a coup d'etat. There was already a disaffected faction among the nobility of Nawab Shuja-ud-Daula. This disaffected faction consisted of people like Mir Jafar, who was the commander-in-chief of the Nawab, the banking house of Jagat Seth that controlled the treasury of Bengal, people like Omi Chand, disaffected zamindars like Raja Manik Chand, Raja Durlabh Rai. Now, all these people, they were opposed to the authority of Siraj-ud-Daula and Clive conspired with these people so that Siraj could be replaced with Mir Jafar, who was the commander-in-chief of Siraj-ud-Daula. The resulting Battle of Plassey was hardly a skirmish and its result was a foregone conclusion. But its political impact was huge. Fugitive Siraj was soon captured and put to death and he was replaced by Mir Jafar, who was merely a puppet in the hands of the East India Company. Now, this was the key significance of the Battle of Plassey. It did not just change the politics, it changed the economics. Mir Jafar became a puppet in the hands of the East India Company and what followed is often referred to as Plassey plunder. What was this Plassey plunder? Immediately after the battle, company received 22.5 million rupees from Mir Jafar. This amount was distributed among the company army and navy officials. Clive himself received a personal valuable jagir. If all this was not enough, there was a change in the structure of the English trade. For example, before 1757, company used to finance its trade in Bengal through the import of bullion. That is to say, like company used to engage in trade and company used to buy handicrafts from Bengal. In order to purchase these handicrafts, company had to bring in gold and silver from England. That is how company used to purchase its products in Bengal. But after Battle of Plassey, this import of bullion from London stopped. Rather, company could use the wealth of the Bengal to finance not just its trade but also its wars in Bengal and other parts of India. So the entire structure of the English trade was changed. This gave massive advantage to the English East India Company over its European rivals. Moreover, the company officials also made huge personal fortunes as a result of Battle of Plassey. They did so using the dastaks or the duty-free trade and through extortion, outright extortion. So Plassey opened the gates not just for the political control but also for massive corruption and illegal extraction. Mir Jafar soon discovered that it would not be easy to be a Nawab under the patronage of the company. he could not satisfy the endless financial demands of the company and its officers. So when he refused to abide by some of the terms presented to him by the company decided to remove him. The company had a simple justification: because it is us who have brought you to the power, so we have the power to replace you with someone else as well. So in 1760, Mir Jafar was replaced by his son-in-law Mir Qasim. The East India Company thought that they had found an ideal puppet in Mir Qasim. Mir Qasim, however, belied the expectations of the company. Mir Qasim was far more capable and independent minded. In order to preserve his autonomy, he did two things. First, he moved his capital from Murshidabad to Mongir in Bihar. He thought that the physical distance would enable him to act independently. Second, he replaced the administration with the people of his choice, the people who were loyal to him. The company did not like this show of independence from Mir Qasim. And that is not all. Mir Qasim did one thing that hit at the core of the financials of the East India Company. East India Company was doing duty-free trade in Bengal, and this trade was a huge disadvantage to Indian merchants because they had to pay duties in Bengal. Now imagine the Indian traders, they are doing trade in Bengal after paying the customs duties. But the English East India Company is doing the same trade in Bengal without paying any customs duty. Naturally, the Indian merchants were at disadvantage. Now what Mir Qasim did was revolutionary. He said that if I cannot stop East India Company, if I cannot force East India Company to pay customs duty, I can remove customs duty altogether. I can also make this trade free for Indian merchants. Company did not like this show of independence by Mir Qasim because this equality hit at the very privilege that East India Company was enjoying. It did not want equality, it wanted privilege. So company decided that they had to remove Mir Qasim again, and they decided to replace him with, guess whom? Mir Jafar. At this point of time, company realized that Mir Jafar was much better than Mir Qasim, so they decided to replace Mir Qasim again with Mir Jafar in 1763. Now, Mir Qasim was in no mood to tamely accept the dictates of the company. He fled from Bengal and began organizing resistance. He formed a grand alliance with Shah Alam II, who was the Mughal emperor, and Shuja-ud-Daula, who was the Nawab of Bengal. The allied armies met the army of the East India Company on the battlefield of Buxar in 1763. Now, allied Indian army was large, but it suffered from poor coordination and traditional military structure. The English army, on the other hand, had better technology and it had unified command. So the result was decisive. While Plassey was the result of a conspiracy, Battle of Buxar was a real war in which the English East India Company defeated the army of the allied Indian powers. Now this is the heart of our topic, and I'll open this topic with a quote. If Plassey opened the door, Buxar secured the house. Plassey had made company the kingmakers in Bengal. Buxar helped them consolidate their control over Bengal. Not just Bengal, even Awadh and the feeble Mughal emperor were at company's mercy after the Battle of Buxar. After the victory, the company treated Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II with respect. Why? Because he still commanded legitimacy in the minds of Indians. From him, they extracted the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765. Under the terms of this treaty, the East India Company got the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. Now what is this Diwani? Diwani is the right to collect revenue and administer civil justice. So this was a major change that was brought in Bengal. The East India Company had got the legal right to collect revenue from these three Mughal regions, Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. That is, it got control over the income of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. Shuja-ud-Daula of Awadh had to agree to pay a sum of 50 lakhs to the company, surrender the areas of Allahabad and Kara, accept a British resident at his court and grant the company the right to duty-free trade. Now these provisions became source of conflict later and laid the groundwork for the future annexation of Awadh itself. Mir Jafar died in 1765 and he was replaced by his son Najmud-Daula. But by this point of time, Nawabs were only ruling in name. The real administration was controlled by officials who were appointed and approved by the East India Company. For example, Deputy Subedar Muhammad Reza Khan. So, a key result of Battle of Buxar was that the independent rule in Bengal had come to an end. Now, in order to understand how company consolidated its rule in Bengal after Buxar, it is important to understand this concept of dual government. This dual government was established in Bengal by Robert Clive after Battle of Buxar. Originally, the Nawabs of Bengal had two important functions, the Diwani functions and the Nizamat functions. The Diwani functions basically refers to the right to collect revenue and administer civil justice. The Nizamat functions, on the other hand, implied the right to administer criminal justice and to maintain law and order. But after the Battle of Buxar, through the Treaty of Allahabad, company had got the Diwani rights over Bengal. That is, it could collect revenue from Bengal and it could administer civil justice in Bengal. On the other hand, Nawab technically retained the Nizamat functions. He was supposed to maintain law and order in Bengal and he was supposed to administer criminal justice in Bengal. But the things did not end here. First of all, the company had resources but it had no responsibilities. Nawab, on the other hand, had responsibilities but he had no resources to fulfill his responsibilities. The result was total anarchy in Bengal. But even in the sphere of authority that remained with Nawab, he was not allowed to function independently. Company said that even though legally you are the Nizam, you have the Nizamat function, you have the administrative responsibility, but we will not allow you to administer Bengal independently. Rather, we would appoint a Deputy Subedar and you cannot dismiss this Deputy Subedar. This Deputy Subedar will administer Bengal on behalf of the Nawab. So, as far as Diwani was concerned, company had the legal authority. As far as Nizamat was concerned, the company had indirect control over the Nizamat through the appointment of Deputy Subedar, and the first person to be appointed was Muhammad Reza Khan. So, this is how practically it was the East India Company that had come to rule Bengal after Battle of Buxar. So, the history of Bengal from 1757 to 1765 is the history of gradual transfer of power from Indian rulers to the East India Company. Plassey made company the kingmaker, Buxar made company the ruler. Diwani gave it the economic control, while the dual government gave it political dominance without responsibility. So that is all as far as this episode of The Love of History is concerned. In the upcoming episodes, we'll move on to the other aspects of the British conquest of India. Till then, take care, happy studying.